In this class, we'll talk about oil, how to choose it and how to change it, the different filters that you'll find on the car and what to do about those, how to change spark plugs and a bit about what the old spark plugs will tell you about how the engine's running, and antifreeze, what to buy and how to change it. So let's get started. Oil. Use the grade that your handbook recommends. It'll give a number. This is SAE 30, that's the viscosity or thickness. It may recommend a grade like 20W50, 15W40. Just go with what the handbook recommends. You'll need a mineral oil for a classic car, is usually enough. There's no need to buy a semi-synthetic or a synthetic, anything fancy like that. Perfectly good mineral oil will be fine. It will have on the back something called an API rating, which has to do with the quality of the oil and the additive package that goes into it. And it's a code, really. You don't have to understand the code, just make sure it has the letters API on it, because that's a basic guarantee of quality. Don't buy anything without. Anything with should be absolutely fine for almost every application. Filters. We've got an air filter here. This is a disposable paper filter. You can take it out periodically and just bat the dust out of it. Every 6,000 to 12,000 miles you'll need to change it, or when it seems to get very dirty. I always mark mine, and I do the same with oil filters as well, with the mileage and the date that it went in, because it's very easy to lose track, especially if you don't use the car all that much. And these things can stay in well past their sell-by date. The oil filter. Most cars probably use one of these types of oil filters. It's essentially a disposable type. If we come over to the engine here, here's the old filter, and this will simply unscrew. I say simply, things are never simple of course, and you might need a special tool just to start it off, because they do seem to tighten themselves on the longer they're on. And a special tool will clamp around it and just start it off for you. Don't struggle with it by hand, you'll hurt yourself. Get a proper tool to do it. You can then start to unscrew the filter. Notice the special design feature of this, which is that you'll get an oily tide coming out of it as it unscrews. So you need to be prepared for that. It's helpful if you're halfway through an oil change to drain the oil out. And I always just loosen this, just a little tiny bit. So oil just weeps very slightly, and that seems to let a bit of air in, and it lets the main body of oil from here down into the sump then. Doesn't work every time, but it's not a bad tip. So be prepared for an oily gush when you take the old filter off. And be prepared also, as it comes to the end of its thread, just get ready to whip it upright so that no more oil pours out of it. You can then dispose of that with the used oil at the recycling place. The new filter, a little smear of oil on the rubber seal, a little smear of oil on the thread, like so. Place it on gently, start it off by hand, and spin it on then till it just stops. Once it's stopped, give it about 3/4 of a turn by hand and no more. Just 3/4 of a turn, and that ensures that when you come to the next service you can actually get the thing off again. And that's all there is to changing an oil filter. The oil change we'll show you on the car in a moment. The last filter we'll talk about is the fuel filter. Now, some people buy and install little inline fuel filters. They're cheap enough, they're about £1 a piece, £2 something. But what you probably didn't know was that there are probably some filters already on your car. There'll be one in the fuel tank, which is obviously a bit of a faff to get to, and that catches really the big dirt, the flakes of things that are floating around in the tank. If you take the top off the fuel pump, you'll probably find a mesh filter inside there. You'll find a bit of sediment perhaps in the bowl underneath it, which can be taken out with some rag. and the mesh filter can be washed in some clean petrol and then blown out, and the whole thing put back together again. The other place you might find one, depending on the car, is on the fuel inlet to the carburetor. So here we've got the fuel inlet. There's what looks like a stop bolt here, and if we unscrew that, you'll need a spanner to start it off. That will come out again with a little mesh filter, and there'll be some sediment probably around it and perhaps a little bit inside here which you'll have to tease out, clean it out, give it a swill around in some fresh petrol and put it back. There's a sealing washer which you may need to replace. You might get away with reusing the old one in extremis in an emergency, but do have a spare one to hand because they have a habit of falling apart if you haven't got a spare one. The spark plugs are found in the cylinder head like this, and these can be unscrewed just with a normal spark plug wrench. The new ones are simply screwed in their place. A couple of tips though. First of all, I always put a little smear of oil or grease on the threads, just a little bit, because again it makes them easier to take out in the future. If you just put them in dry, they can tend to set in place and you've got a bit of a problem then. Secondly, do check the gap on the plug because it may be different. What you've been supplied with, the gap between the electrodes may be different from what the manufacturer recommends, so do just check and set that gap. And while you've got the old plugs out, have a look at them because they'll tell you something about how the engine's running. So I've just taken this out of a car that was running earlier today, and I can see that the nose of the plug, the front of the nose is a nice sort of biscuit brown colour, and that says that everything's fine. A nice biscuit brown colour is what you want to look for. It doesn't matter whether it's very light or heavy deposits, really doesn't matter. It's a bit of a conundrum, this one, because if I look at the back of it, it's very white, which says the mixture's too weak or the ignition timing's too advanced. So obviously something's just on the verge of not being right, so I'll look into that later. The other common thing you'll find is a plug which is very black around the electrodes, and this is a sign that the engine's running too rich. But beware, if you've recently run it into the garage on the choke or been shunting it around the yard on the choke for a long time, the plugs will be black anyway, so just think about how you use the car immediately before saying, ooh, there's something wrong with the car. When you put the new plugs in then, start them off always by hand, always, because it's very easy to cross-thread them. If you're using a tool, it's very easy to cross-thread them and wind it in with the tool, and then you ruin the threads in the cylinder head. The whole thing's a wreck and needs to go off for repair. Start them off by hand, and you should be able to screw them in most of the way by hand before finishing them off with the spark plug wrench. And if it's a new plug, just give it about half a turn from where the plug stops. If it's an old plug, just nip it up tight. And the difference is a little compressible sealing washer just here on the plug, which obviously is not compressed when the plug's new, but when it's been in and out a few times, it is. Last of all, antifreeze. There's a bit of a choice of antifreezes around at the moment. There never used to be. Basically, your choice used to be this blue-green ethylene glycol or nothing at all. And recently, some new generation coolants have come in, which are usually red or orange in colour. They can be a bit of a nuisance with classic cars because they sometimes can affect some of the metals and materials used in the engine of a classic car. So we recommend really that you stick with the old-fashioned ethylene glycol, still widely available, cheaper than the new stuff. You should change it every 2 years, no longer than every 3 years. And the main reason for this is not that it loses its anti-freezing capabilities, but that it loses its anti-corrosion capabilities. And this really is why I'd recommend you to use antifreeze. It's not so much that you might get caught out in winter, because you could always drain the system in winter when the car's not being used. The thing is, it prevents an awful lot of havoc in between, from corrosion of alloy parts like water pump housings and things, to corrosion of the block. I took a core plug out of a block the other week and a pile of rust literally fell out of it. So these sorts of things can badly affect your engine. So ethylene glycol coolant, swap it every 2 or 3 years, and you mix it with water. And you'll want to use either soft water, if you live in a soft water area, or go mad and buy some deionized or distilled water as sold for irons and batteries and things. You can buy it in gallon containers. Mix it. I always mix it 30% antifreeze, or a third antifreeze to 2/3 water. And that should be a perfectly adequate mix for British conditions. Some people do it 1-to-1. I think that's unnecessary, really. It won't do any harm, though. Don't mix it any more than 1-to-1, because if you get this mixture too strong and the weather gets really cold, this stuff will actually turn to a mush, believe it or not. Instead of resisting freezing longer, it will turn to a mush and start to freeze itself. So 1/3, 2/3 mix of antifreeze and water is what we generally recommend. Well, let's get on and see how some of this stuff's done in practice, shall we? We'll start with the oil change. Okay, so now we're ready to change the oil. First of all, do make sure that whatever the sump plug is, this one's just a normal hex bolt, others take Allen keys, some take a square plug. Do make sure that you've got a good tool that will fit it and fit it well, because you don't want to destroy the thing if it's a bit tight. So hold the tool to it. You can give it a little knock to start it off if you want to, if it's tight, and then you should be able to start unscrewing it. Now, mostly this is done with the engine hot. You warm the engine up, you take the plug out, and the hot thin oil flows right out. If you've had an engine that's been stood for a very long time, say a few years, then all the sediment and muck will have collected at the bottom of the sump, and it would be silly to start the engine and circulate all this muck through the engine. So in that case, you would actually do it, as we're doing it, cold. You'll see probably the oil is a little bit gloopy when it comes out. Now, you'd be doing this on ramps probably. For just ease of filming, we're obviously doing this on a lift here. So we've got our sump oil container, and we've got it fairly close up here against the sump, so that the oil hopefully will go into it nice and neatly. We'll find that out in a minute. Do make sure that your oil container holds enough oil to drain the sump. A lot of people cut down a 5-litre oil container, drain the sump and find the sump held 6 litres. That makes a mess on the drive. So, carefully now. This will gush out all of a sudden.
Just drop it down slightly.
Okay, and there we go. When you're certain of your ground, then you can let it go and just give it a few minutes to slowly drain out. Okay, so that's been draining for about 5 minutes or so, and it's nearly done. You could wait forever for the last drip to come out, so at some point we can put the sump plug back in. This sump plug uses a little copper washer on it, which is a seal which will just make sure it's nice and oil tight when it goes back in. You can reuse the old one, but there's always a risk that it'll spend the next 6,000 miles dripping all over your lovely block paving, so frankly, for a couple of pence, just put a new one on. So we can pop that in there. Always start it by hand, because very easy things, as you can see, to cross thread and not start correctly. So that's going in nicely by hand now. I'm just going to move our drain container carefully out of the way, avoiding a catastrophe there. So we can continue to screw that in by hand. And when it's 2, take it up with the spanner like that till the spanner stops, and then just a little swing on the spanner just till you feel it squeeze the copper washer and no more. It won't fall out onto the road, just actually the squeeze of the copper washer will help to keep it in. Some cars have no washer, they have a tapered plug. The threads get very slightly wider, so it gets tighter and tighter as you screw it in. And the principle is the same, just screw it in as far as you can by hand, put the tool on it, give it a little swing, say a quarter of a turn or something, just so it nips up tightish, and then leave it. That will be enough. Right, so now we've done that, let's go up top and put some oil back in the engine. Okay, so we've got the sump plug firmly in now. We've got a new oil filter on, so it's time to refill with oil. Make sure you know how much the car takes so that A, you can buy enough, and B, of course, you can watch how much is going in on the scale on the side of the bottle. Pour it from the side like this. Don't sort of glug it in like that because it'll glug everywhere. Just pour it gently in from the side. Pour it gradually because sometimes what happens, the oil goes into the rocker cover and it has to drain down little holes to get to the sump. Sometimes you pour it in faster than it drains away. The filter, the funnel fills up and there's a terrible overflowing event, so don't fall victim to that. While we pour it gently in, a nice touch at the end of this is to just take the wire off the coil, preferably one of the 12-volt wires, and just get in and turn the engine over. So it won't start because there's no wire on the coil. And just turn the engine over on the starter until the oil light goes out. And that not only tells you that the system is now primed with the new oil, but it also primes everything and gets everything full of oil just with the starter gently turning it, rather than explosions in the cylinders pounding everything together before it's quite ready. Okay, let's see how we're doing. I think that's about okay. So our next job is to fill the car with fresh coolant. Right, so to change the coolant, there may be a drain plug in the radiator here and one in the engine, but a lot of cars don't have this. So what you have to do instead is to remove the bottom hose, which is the hose which runs from the engine block, or usually from the thermostat actually, to the bottom tank of the radiator. You can spray a bit of penetrating oil on the hose clip if it's a little bit rusty. What I usually do is to just push it back a bit out of the way. You can just pry a screwdriver slightly underneath the hose like that if you want to start it off. Don't jam it all the way up because you'll damage the radiator. But once you've just pried it a little, get hold of the hose and twist it, and that will tend to break the seal because it just tends to just stick itself in place. So once you've done that, you can prepare to remove the hose. Now, a lot of authorities say you should do this with the engine hot, and that's a good idea in the sense that it gets all the sediment swirling around and ready to come out. It's a bad idea though in the sense that you can scald yourself fairly badly because the water does tend to spurt out when it comes out. Do remove the filler plug or the radiator cap from above because that'll just assist the fluid in coming out. So this will just take a few minutes to drain out. I mean, it's a very quick process. So once that's all out of the way, we can move our bowl and slip the radiator hose back on. Do just check it to make sure it's in good condition. There's no point putting a cracked one back on because it'll just leak your new antifreeze after a while. Wriggle it into position, give it a little twist so it's sat nicely, and then simply tighten the hose clip up at a nice convenient angle for you to get at and where it's not going to interfere with anything like fan blades or anything like that. Okay, so now we're going to go up top and refill the system. Okay, so with the bottom hose on, or the drain plugs back in or whatever, it's time to fill the engine with antifreeze. Normally, you'd fill one through a radiator cap, or perhaps through this radiator type cap on the expansion bottle. This one's slightly unusual in that you fill it through a little hole in the top of the thermostat housing, and because that's a bit of a fiddle, we've equipped ourselves with this very fine funnel. And just beware of bubbling back and things here, of course. We've mixed the antifreeze, as we described earlier. I'm going to slowly pour the quantity in. Now, when it's all in, it's a good idea actually to mix the complete quantity because then you know that it's all in and that there aren't any airlocks. Make sure the heater's on because that opens the heater valve up and that space can fill with water. And just pour it slowly in. You'll hear it bubbling away as the air is slowly released. Now I pop this plug back on. It has a little rubber O-ring there which we renewed. Mostly with a radiator cap. Just check the cap for general condition, and if it has a rubber seal, check that's in good condition. Just going to tighten this up a little bit. The rubber O-ring will compress and seal it naturally, so I don't need to really force it. Just hand tight on the socket is enough. And that should be that. You can run the engine and just check the coolant level afterwards. Good idea to run it right up to temperature because that opens the thermostat, circulates everything, and then you'll know when you check the level afterwards that you've put the correct amount in. Don't ever take the cap off to check the level while the engine is hot because you're likely to get a release of steam or scalding water. Always check the water level with the engine cold, and that's how it's designed to be checked as well, because it expands and you get a false sense of the level anyway when it's hot, so always check it cold. So that's the end of this class. If you return to the main menu, there's a selection of other classes to choose from next.